I had been searching for a new couch for weeks when I finally found the perfect one on Craigslist. It was a beautiful vintage piece that would fit perfectly in my living room, so I quickly contacted the seller and arranged for delivery that same day. I thought it was a great deal because not only was I getting a couch for a great price, but also the guy selling it was willing to drive all the way over to my house to deliver it in person. So, later that day, the man arrived with the couch, but I noticed he was quite strange from the moment I opened the door. He had long, greasy hair and piercing blue eyes, but it looked like he hadn't showered in weeks. He didn't even introduce himself, but instead silently carried the couch into my living room and set it down. I offered to help, but he waved me off and insisted on doing it himself, so I just backed off and let him get on with it. As he moved the couch, I noticed that he seemed to be struggling with it, as if it was heavier than he expected. But again, when I tried to lend a hand, he snapped at me and told me to stay out of the way. So I decided to give him more space and retreated to the kitchen to make some tea. I remember as I was waiting for the kettle to boil, I heard a strange noise coming from the living room. It sounded like someone was whispering, but I couldn't make out any words. I called out to the man, asking if everything was okay, but he didn't respond. When I walked back into the living room, I found the man standing in front of the couch, staring at it intently. His eyes were wide and his breathing was heavy. I asked him if he was feeling all right, but he just ignored me. But then suddenly, the man turned to face me, and I could see that his eyes had changed. They were no longer a bright blue, but instead they were almost black and soulless. It was as if he was possessed by something evil. "Are you sure you want this couch?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. I tried to back away, but the man took a step forward. "You can't leave without taking it, for it is already inside of you." Now, I had no idea what this meant, but I knew it wasn't good, so I pushed past him and ran to my own front door. But as I tried to flee, he grabbed me by the arm and pulled me back. As I struggled to escape his grip, I noticed something odd about the couch. There were strange markings etched into the fabric, symbols that I didn't recognize. And then I saw something move inside the cushions, something dark and writhing. I screamed and fought harder, and finally managed to break free and run out of the apartment. But as I fled down the stairs, I could hear the man laughing maniacally behind me. I reported the incident to the police, but they didn't take me seriously. They said that I was probably just imagining things and I shouldn't have bought a couch off of Craigslist in the first place. But I knew what I had seen, and there was no way that I was going back to that apartment with that couch inside of there, and possibly that man. Well, anyway, I had no choice, and I had to return back to my place in order to see if he had finally left and if I could just move on with my life. And as I arrived at the apartment, I noticed those same markings that were on the couch were now on my floor. But the man was gone. Again, I didn't know what to make of this, so I just called the police and demanded that they send a car over immediately, as the case had clearly escalated since I last spoke to them. They did send a car round eventually, and they took down some notes, but nothing ever happened. The irony was that I ended up having to spend money to get rid of that couch, so I may as well have just bought a regular priced couch from anywhere. But hey, at least I learnt my lesson, right? People always say that I'm an adventurous and easygoing person, and I'm definitely one of those people who likes to be spontaneous. But after the incident that I went through during my trip to Japan, I've learnt that sometimes it might be better to just stick with your initial plans. This was the very first trip that I went on with a friend without my family present. We had just graduated secondary school and we'd worked at a hotel as waitresses for a few months, so we were able to save up just enough money to go on a 5-day trip to Japan. We'd booked the cheapest flight and the cheapest hotel in the area, trying to save as much money as possible for food and shopping and other things. Well, the big day finally arrived, and we were both really excited. I remember we were sitting at the gate just doing some final checks, and that's when we realised that we hadn't bought a pocket Wi-Fi or a travel SIM card for the trip. If you've not heard of these, they're basically just a way to use data in a foreign country to allow internet access wherever you are. We both agreed that we probably didn't even need it, as we were mostly going to tourist attractions which we would surely be able to find on our own. So we quickly went onto Google Maps and took a few screenshots of the places that we would be visiting, and the route between the hotel and the tourist attractions. We'd also screenshotted the trains and the bus routes that we would need to be taking. So at this point, we felt quite confident and even thought that we were really smart, as by doing this we'd saved some money that we could now spend elsewhere on the trip. For the first few days, it was going really well. We got lost a few times, but whenever we did, we would just ask the locals for help, and they always knew the correct ways and guided us to wherever we needed to go. Most people would consider Japan as a safe place, and so did we, so we weren't nervous or worried at all about getting lost in Japan. And so, with this in mind, on the afternoon of day 4, we planned to travel from Kyoto to Nara, which was less than a 2-hour train journey. We walked down to the station, and we saw the word Nara on the screen, so we assumed that this was the train we needed. But little did we know that we would be walking to the incorrect platform, and therefore the incorrect train. During the journey, we were still joking around and both in a really good mood. But it was roughly 2 hours later where we both got a bit confused, as we thought we would have arrived by now. But we just assumed that there was probably some delays and we would be arriving in Nara soon enough. Whenever the train stopped, we would check if it was the station that we needed to get off at, but after almost 3 more hours, the train finally stopped, and didn't move again. This is when we realised that the train had come to the end of its journey, and we clearly were not in Nara. We got off the train staring at this unfamiliar station name, and we were both so confused. But still in high spirits, not long after, we started laughing as we couldn't believe we'd actually got on the wrong train, and we were now at some random remote town in Japan. Well, being spontaneous and wanting to make the most of the situation, I suggested that we may as well go explore this town a little bit, as we might find some really cool places that we could brag about to our friends. So, we walked around a little bit, and to be fair, there weren't many shops and it was mostly just a residential area. But eventually, we found a little izakaya, which is a Japanese pub where you can order alcohol and barbecue snacks. We went in and found a table in the corner, but not long after, a pair of men that were sitting next to our table started chatting with us. At first we thought they were just being nice, as they could definitely tell we were tourists. However, they started asking questions like, which hotel are you staying at? Do you need a lift anywhere? And even asked if we would like to go to another pub with them to spend the night. We weren't sure if they were being genuine or not, but we definitely felt a bit uncomfortable. Well, we repeatedly turned down their advances, but every time we said no, they would just stare at us as if they wouldn't take no for an answer. And then they would come up with another idea to suggest. As we were sitting in the corner, my friend's back was facing the wall, and behind me there were boxes stacked up, so we were kind of stuck in this corner, unless they allowed us to leave. Suddenly, one of the men's phones started ringing, and he got up and headed outside to talk. I then quickly stood up and asked for the bill, hoping that we would be able to pay for the food and head back to the station as soon as possible, and escape from the two strange men. The other man, who was still sitting next to us, just stared as we packed our bags and rushed out of our seats. We finally got out of the restaurant, and we could hear the other man still talking on his phone just around the corner, so we both tried to keep as quiet as possible while power walking to the station. We followed the path that we were walking before, and after a few minutes had passed, we both started talking about what had happened in the restaurant, and were so thankful that we had managed to get out of there. As it was now almost 10 o'clock at night, we hadn't seen many people on our way to the station. However, I could hear some footsteps that were fast approaching. I thought to myself it might be someone who had just finished a late shift trying to quickly head home. Or maybe they were needing to catch a train or something. We both stepped to the right side of the pavement as we didn't want to be in the way of whoever those people were. But, to my surprise, that's when I felt someone touching my fingers and trying to hold my hand. I was frightened and quickly shook off the hand as I looked back, and to my horror, it was the two men that were talking to us in the restaurant. Me and my friend both froze to the spot, staring at them in disbelief. They offered to give us a lift and said that they lived just around the corner, so we can walk to their car with them. But we just kept saying no thank you, and that's when I grabbed my friend's arm to keep us walking to the station. At this point, I just wanted to get out of the situation, but no matter what, they just kept following us. By now my fear had turned into anger, and I stopped to look back at them once more, and shouted no as loud as I could. I proceeded to type in 110 on the dialing keypad of my phone and showed it to them. Just in case you didn't know, 110 is the same as 911 in the US. Well, once they saw this, they eventually started stepping back, and I stared at them until they actually turned their backs to us and left. After this, we started running towards the train station, while looking back every other second, fearing that they might return. But luckily, we never saw them again. I still remember when we got to the station, we both cried, and we were so relieved that we were now safe. On the following day, we weren't able to enjoy ourselves quite as much, as we were still taken back from what had happened the night before. To be honest, I felt a bit guilty, as I was the one who suggested not buying the portable Wi-Fi. And again, it was me who suggested that we not follow our initial plans and go exploring that remote town. So I now live with the regret of putting my friend through that traumatic experience, as none of this would have happened if we had just stuck to the plan. It was the summer before my senior year of high school, and my parents had decided to take me and my little sister on a road trip. We were starting in our hometown and travelling down the coast to visit different states and attractions. Our first stop was a well-known theme park that my parents had always wanted to take us to. My little sister was ecstatic about the idea of spending the day riding roller coasters and going on water rides, and I couldn't wait to try out all the park's famous treats. We arrived early in the morning, just as the park was opening. I remember the sun was shining and the air was crisp, making it the perfect day to be outside. As we walked through the park, my parents pointed out different attractions and rides that they had remembered from their own childhoods. I couldn't help but smile as I watched my little sister's face light up with excitement at every turn. As the day wore on, the park did become more crowded and the lines for the rides grew even longer. But despite this, we were having a great time. We had just finished up on one of the biggest roller coasters in the park, when suddenly, the lights on the ride flickered. At first we thought it was just a minor glitch, but then the ride jerked to a stop, and the emergency lights came on. At this point, the power had gone out in the entire park, leaving everything in complete darkness. Screams and cries could be heard echoing through the park as people stumbled around, trying to find their way out. My parents immediately grabbed my sister's hand and told me to follow closely behind as we made our way to the nearest exit. But as we walked, the darkness seemed to swallow us up, making it nearly impossible to see where we were going. As we turned a corner, we heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the ride that we had just been on. My heart raced as I turned to look, but the darkness prevented me from seeing anything. My little sister began to cry, her sobs adding to the eerie silence that surrounded us. The grip that my parents had on my hand started to tighten as we tried to navigate our way through the maze of attractions. Just as we were about to reach the exit, I heard a strange whispering sound coming from behind us. I turned to look, but all I could see was the faint outline of a figure in the darkness. It was then that I realized that we were being followed. We walked faster, but the whispers grew louder, almost like they were right beside us. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the darkness and grabbed my little sister's arm. My parents immediately pulled her towards them, but the hand wouldn't let go. In a panic, we all started to scream for help, but it felt like there was no one around to hear us. The hand's grip grew tighter and tighter, making my sister cry out in pain. But just as I thought we were doomed, a group of security guards appeared out of nowhere. They pried the hand away from my sister and pulled us towards safety. As we were escorted out of the park, I couldn't help but wonder what had caused the power outage and who the mysterious figure in the darkness had been. Well, after what felt like an eternity, the power finally came back on. The lights flickered back to life, illuminating the darkened park once again. As we stood on the other side of the exit doors, we were met by what looked like hundreds of other guests who were all discussing similar experiences to the one that we experienced. There was this one family that we spoke to that said they couldn't find their daughter. My dad even offered to go back into the park to try and find her, but the security officers wouldn't let him, saying it was too dangerous. Well, we waited around for a few more hours, hoping that she would return, but in the end there was nothing we could do. We went back to our car, and my parents swore that we would just drive home. After this traumatic experience, none of us really wanted to continue on the road trip. Well, years have now passed, and my family and I still reminisce about the traumatic events of that night. We never found out if that family's daughter was found safe and sound, but we can only hope that she was okay. Back in the 80s, I lived on my family's farm. It was a beautiful place, with rolling hills, lush green fields, and a sense of peace and tranquility that was hard to find anywhere else. But one summer, my overwhelmingly positive view of such a beautiful place had completely turned on its head. I remember I was out checking on the crops at the time when I saw it. A perfect circle in the middle of one of our cornfields. At first I thought it was just a strange natural occurrence, but as I walked closer, I realized that it was something else entirely. The grass in the circle was flattened, as if something heavy had landed there, but there was no sign of any tracks, and no indication of what could have caused it. It was like the circle had simply appeared out of nowhere. Well, safe to say, I was spooked, but I tried to brush it off as one of those strange coincidences. Perhaps a group of animals had gathered there, Or maybe it was just some strange weather phenomenon. I was never a believer in UFOs or anything extraterrestrial, so it was quite easy for me to shrug it off. But then, a few days later, another circle appeared, in a different field. This one was larger, and there were strange symbols etched into the grass. They looked like some kind of ancient script, but I couldn't make sense of them. It was honestly like nothing I had ever seen before. I didn't know what else to do, so I just tried to ignore it. But as the days went on, more and more circles started to appear. They were all different sizes, with strange markings etched into the grass. And every time a new one appeared, I felt a sense of unease deep in my gut. I started to do some research, trying to find out if anyone else had experienced something similar. I found other stories of crop circles, of strange patterns appearing in fields all over the world. Some people believed they were hoaxes, while others claimed they were the work of extraterrestrial beings. I didn't know what to believe, but the more circles that appeared on our farm, the more I felt like something otherworldly was at play. One night I decided to camp out in the field where the circles had first appeared. I wanted to see if I could catch whatever was causing them in the act. I was lying there watching the stars when I saw something move. It was a black figure half emerged in the cornfield, but I could just about make out a tall and slender body. I was very startled and tried to run, but that's when I heard it start speaking to me, in a language I didn't understand. I don't remember much after that. When I rack my brain to try and remember what happened, all I see is a blur of strange lights, distorted voices, and a feeling of being pulled in a million different directions at once. When I woke up, I was back in my tent, but something was different. The world around me now seemed brighter, more vivid. The colours were more vibrant, the air was cleaner, and the sounds were sharper. I felt like I had been reborn, like everything was new and exciting. But as the days went on, I started to notice that things weren't quite right. My senses were heightened to an almost unbearable degree, and I started to see things that weren't there. Shadows would move when there was no one around, and strange whispers would echo in my ears. Well, this wasn't the only time I saw that figure, as one night I saw it again, standing at the edge of the field, watching me. Once again, I could just about hear its voice speaking to me, but this time I could understand it. From what I could gather, it told me that it was from another world, that it had been studying our planet for centuries, and it had chosen me. It said it wanted me to be its representative on Earth, to help it understand our ways and our customs. At first I was afraid, but the more I talked to the creature, the more I realized that it truly meant no harm. It was simply curious, and it wanted to learn. So I agreed to help. The creature slowly stepped forward toward me, but as it began to get closer to me, suddenly it vanished. I was left with so many questions, but as strange as it all was, I still knew that I had been chosen for a reason. I was meant to help bridge the gap between our two worlds, to help us understand each other and work together for the greater good. I still have that feeling like I'm being watched, but now it isn't so bad. If anything, it feels like a good friend is watching over me. So now, every time I see another crop circle on our farm, I smile, knowing that it's a sign that my friend from another world is still watching over me, still curious and still learning. And I feel more than grateful that I was chosen to be a part of something so extraordinary. I had been looking forward to my Friday night in all week. Ordering some Chinese takeout and settling down to watch some movies was one of my favourite things to do. I lived alone at the time, but I really didn't mind. I always enjoyed my own company, and I liked having the freedom to do whatever I wanted without having to answer to anyone. That night I called my local Chinese restaurant, but they were apparently extremely busy, giving me an estimated delivery time of around 2 hours. Now, this place was honestly the best Chinese in town, so I did consider waiting at first, but my stomach rumbled with reservation, and I reluctantly ended up deciding to order food from another place. I downloaded one of the apps, and after looking through the menu, I ordered my food. At first, I was pleasantly surprised to see a 5-star rating, and all my favourite dishes were available, so I didn't think too much of it and continued with my plans for the evening. However, I had failed to notice that the 5-star review for this restaurant was only based on 2 individual reviews, a fact which soon made itself very clear. Anyway, about an hour after placing my order, there was a knock at the door. I excitedly got up from the couch and checked the peephole, and saw a man standing outside my door. He was wearing a delivery uniform, and he had a large white bag in his hand. I eagerly opened the door and was greeted with a strange-looking man with what looked like a black wig falling out of his baseball cap. "Hi there. I've got your delivery," he said, handing me the bag. I said thanks, taking the bag and rummaging in my pockets for a tip. As I struggled to search my pocket with one hand, he suddenly spoke again, asking, "Are you home alone?" His eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, as I started to feel a great sense of unease. He was practically looking me up and down as he waited for my response, like I was a piece of meat. I felt a chill run down my spine at this question. I didn't want him to know I was home alone, but I was never a good liar. No, actually, my roommate is just in the shower," I said, trying to sound convincing, but the delivery man didn't seem convinced at all. He suddenly stepped forward, blocking me from closing the door. "Are you sure about that?" I felt a lump form in my throat as I realized that I was now in real danger. I tried to push him out so I could close the door, but he was too heavy and barely moved an inch. He just laughed and pushed his way into my apartment, slamming the door behind him. I screamed for him to get out, trying to push him back once again, but he just kept laughing, and that's when he grabbed me by the arm, pulling me towards him. "I don't think so," he said, his breath hot on my face. I did continue to struggle against him, but he just kept pushing me in whichever direction he wanted, which ended up being towards the living room, as I stumbled and fell onto the couch. "You're not going anywhere," he said, as he pulled something out of his pocket. I screamed for help, but I knew that no one would hear me. I used to think that one of the best aspects of my apartment was that it had very thick walls, so you could never hear the neighbours. But in this moment, it was far from a blessing. As I lied there, trying to stay strong and fight back, but also slowly growing closer to the inevitable reality that was quickly approaching, I remembered the lock on my bedroom door. I knew that if I could get there somehow, I had a chance to lock myself in and call the police. So I used all of my might and scratched at his face, causing him to take a step back as he covered his eye with one hand. I capitalized on the moment by scrambling to my feet and running towards the bedroom. But the man was right behind me the whole way, brandishing his weapon. I managed to make it to the bedroom without him catching me, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it as quickly as possible. I felt a momentary sense of relief, but knowing that the man was still outside, trying to force his way in, I also knew it was only a matter of time before he got in and would have me alone in my bedroom. I could hear him shouting and banging on the door, and I knew that he wasn't going to give up easily. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I told them what was happening. The operator told me to stay on the line and keep talking, and I obeyed, trying to distract myself from the sounds of the man outside. Well, eventually I hadn't heard him shouting, and it had been a few minutes since he last banged on the door. But this didn't mean I was safe. He very well could have been waiting for me to unlock the door to check if he had gone, and then he would use that moment to strike. Well, I was promised that an officer would arrive within 5 minutes, and to their credit, it wasn't long at all before I heard the sound of sirens outside. The police had arrived, and I was so relieved, but also still scared as I didn't know what this man was capable of. The police stormed into my apartment, and I heard them shouting, but there were no sounds of struggle. They eventually knocked on the bedroom door, asking if I was in there and if I was okay, to which I opened the door and burst into tears. They wrapped a blanket around me and asked me a few questions. Apparently the man had already fled the scene and there was no sign of him. They also inspected the white bag, and rather than Chinese food, they found pretty much every ingredient you can imagine, where he clearly had been planning to tie me up and do God knows what. Well, as you can imagine, I was glad to be alive, but still incredibly shaken up, especially knowing that he was still out there somewhere. I did follow up with the police a few times, but unfortunately, they never had any leads or useful updates. They recommended I install cameras to help protect myself and be extra careful when ordering things online, but this was no way to live. I ended up cutting my lease short and moving to a new apartment on the other side of town. It was such a shame, because I loved that apartment, but I had no choice in the end. I was unable to sleep at night, and I pretty much lived in fear every single day. I still hold out hope that they will catch him eventually, and who knows, maybe they already have. But either way, I know I will never order food online again, as you never know who might be knocking on your door. I was excited to spend the day at the new theme park that had just opened up in town. My family and I had been looking forward to it for weeks. As soon as we entered the park, we were greeted by a group of friendly clowns handing out balloons. I couldn't help but smile at their silly antics, but one clown caught my attention in particular. He was tall and thin, with a painted-on smile that looked more like a grimace. His eyes were sunken and dark, and his voice was low and raspy. He introduced himself as Jester, and offered to take a photo with me and my family. As we walked through the park, I started to notice that Jester seemed to be everywhere that we went. He would pop up out of nowhere, his face inches away, and then disappear just as quickly. I started to feel very uneasy by this, and my parents noticed that I was getting upset. My mum tried to reassure me, explaining that he was just a clown and he was supposed to be funny. But Jester didn't seem very funny to me. He seemed more sinister, like he was hiding something behind that painted-on smile. I tried to avoid him, but no matter where we went in the park, he was always there. As the day wore on, I started to notice that the other clowns seemed to be avoiding Jester. Whenever he would join them, they would seem to scurry away as if they were afraid of him or disliked him in some way. I wondered if I was the only one who felt like something was off about him. Late in the afternoon, my parents and brother decided to go on a roller coaster, but I didn't feel like going on any more rides. I told them I would meet them at the exit and started walking toward the nearest bathroom. But before I could get there, Jester appeared in front of me, blocking my path. "Where are you going, little girl?" he asked, his voice taking on a menacing tone. I'm just going to the bathroom," I stammered. "You don't want to go in there," he said, shaking his head. "It's not safe, but I know a much better place. Here, follow me." I didn't want to follow him, but I felt like I didn't have any other choice. He led me to a dark corner of the park where a small tent was set up. It was covered in black and white stripes, like a circus tent, but there was no sign or name on it. Jester led me inside, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The interior of the tent was dark and cramped, with flickering lights casting strange shadows all over the walls. Jester pulled out a deck of cards and started shuffling them, his eyes fixed on mine. "Pick a card, any card," he said, holding out the deck. I reached for a card, but before I could touch it, Jester snatched the deck away. His smile had disappeared, replaced by a scowl. "You're not like the others," he said, his voice cold and angry. "You're special. You can see through the illusion." I tried to back away, but he grabbed my arm, holding me in place. I could feel his breath on my face, and that's when I knew I was in real danger. Suddenly, there was a loud banging on the side of the tent. It was my dad, calling out for my name. Jester released me and disappeared out of one of the exit doors, leaving me alone in the tent. I rushed out, relieved to see my dad waiting for me outside. He could see the terror in my eyes and immediately asked me what was wrong. I told him everything about the clown, and he listened to me carefully, and we decided to go straight to the park management to report the incident. Well, after a long wait, we finally got to speak to the management and reported everything. They told us that they didn't have any employee by the name of Jester, and that they would launch an investigation immediately. My family and I left the park that day, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that Jester was still watching us. Days went by, and we didn't hear back from the park management. My parents had already decided to forget about the incident and move on, but I couldn't forget. I can never forget. Every time I close my eyes, I see Jester's face. But I remember one day, when I was watching the news, a story caught my attention. It was about a series of disappearances that had been occurring in the area. The newscaster reported that one of the victims had been last seen at the very same theme park we had visited. My heart sank as I realized that Jester may be the one responsible for those disappearances. My family and I went straight to the authorities and told them everything we knew about Jester and the tent. They investigated and actually found out that the man behind the Jester costume was a criminal on the run from the law, and had been using the theme park as a cover for his illegal activities. They finally caught him and brought him to justice, but the trauma of that day has still never left me. I never went back to that theme park even after he was caught, and I still shudder whenever I see a clown or anything resembling Jester's face. I woke up in a daze, feeling like I had just been drugged. The last thing I remembered was driving home after a long shift at the hospital, where I worked as a nurse. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move my arms or legs. Panic soon set in, as I realized that I was strapped to a cold, metal table. Looking around, I saw that I was in a dimly lit room with strange equipment lining the walls. The air was filled with an awful smell that I can only describe as burned metal. Then I heard a soft humming sound, like a low-pitched chant. Suddenly, a bright light filled the room, and I shielded my eyes, but once the light had faded, that's when I saw them. They were not human. They were tall, thin, and grey, with large, almond-shaped black eyes. They had long arms and fingers, with no discernible mouths or noses. I struggled to free myself from the restraints, but they were on too tight. The figures started to approach me, and I could feel their cold, slimy touch on my skin as they began to examine me. I could see the fear in their eyes as they probed me with strange instruments. They seemed fascinated by my body, studying me as if I were some kind of rare specimen. As the probing continued, I began to feel a strange sense of detachment, as if I was no longer in my body. I felt as if I was floating, weightless and free. It was as if the aliens were able to control my thoughts and emotions, and that was possibly the scariest thing of all. The probing lasted for what felt like hours, and when it was finally over, they left the room, leaving me alone, yet still strapped to the cold table. I laid there, shivering and confused, trying to make sense of what the hell just happened. Well, after a long struggle, I was finally able to free myself from the restraints, and staggered out of the room, disoriented. As I stumbled down the dark hallway, I realized that I was no longer in the same place where I had been abducted. Everything was unfamiliar, and I had no idea where I was, or how I would ever find my way back home. I wandered through the corridors of the strange metallic structure, looking for any sign of escape. But no matter how far I walked, I seemed to be going in circles, always ending up in the same room where I had been probed and examined. As time passed, I grew weaker and more disoriented. My mind was filled with strange thoughts, and I began to wonder if I would ever be able to escape. Eventually, I gave up, and I returned to the room to get some sleep. The next morning, I decided to start searching again, and I stumbled upon a room filled with strange, glowing crystals. As I approached them, I felt a sudden surge of energy, and my body began to levitate off the ground. With a sudden burst of courage, I flew through the walls of the alien ship and out into the vast expanse of space. The sight that greeted me was both breathtaking and terrifying. The stars seemed to stretch out endlessly in every direction, and I could see planets and galaxies beyond anything I had ever imagined. But even as I marveled at the wonders of the universe, I knew that I was still in grave danger. The aliens were surely searching for me, and it was only a matter of time before they found me and brought me back. I flew on, driven by a desperate need to survive, and as I soared through the infinite reaches of space, I realized that the aliens had taken something from me, something precious and irreplaceable, and I was determined to get it back. With every passing moment, I grew stronger and more determined. And as I raced through the cosmos, I knew that I would stop at nothing to reclaim what had been stolen from me, for I was no longer a mere human being. I was something much more, something greater that the aliens had never seen before. As I flew on, I began to feel a strange power coursing through me, as if the very fabric of the universe was now at my command. I could feel the energy of the stars and the planets flowing through me, and I knew that I was no longer bound by the limitations of my physical body. And with this new-found power, I set out to track down the aliens who had abducted me, determined to make them pay for what they had done. I searched the vastness of space, following every clue and lead that I could find, until I finally stumbled upon what was their home planet. It was sad, really. They lived on a desolate, barren place, filled with towering spires of metal and strange, pulsing energy fields. But I still didn't hesitate. With a fierce determination, I swooped down, unleashing my newfound powers upon them. The aliens were caught off guard, unable to comprehend the power that I now possessed. They tried to fight back, but it was no use. I was too strong, too powerful, and in the end, they were no match for me. As I stood over their defeated bodies, I knew that I had finally reclaimed what had been taken from me. I had regained my freedom, my autonomy, and my sense of self. And as I looked out over the endless expanse of space, I knew that I had become something much more than just a simple human being. I was now a force to be reckoned with, a being of immense power and potential. And so, with a sense of triumph and purpose, I set out once more into the stars, ready to explore the universe and discover the mysteries that lay hidden within its depths. For I was no longer a victim of the aliens' cruel experiments. I was a warrior, a survivor, and a symbol of hope for all of those who had been taken by the unknown and the unknowable.
Oliver, it's time to take your meds. Now, don't make me come and get you.
Ah, yes. And what was my reward for this triumph? Well, as soon as I returned to Earth, expecting a parade, instead, I was thrown into a loony bin with a bunch of degenerates. But it doesn't matter. I'll show them. One day, they will see my true power.
Oliver, how many times do I have to tell you?
It was the late 90s, and I was working as a pizza delivery driver to make some extra money. It was a typical night until I got an order to deliver to an old run-down motel on the outskirts of town. I thought this was odd, but every now and again we would get an order for a hotel of some sort, so I went ahead to the delivery location. The motel was in a creepy place, with flickering lights and peeling wallpaper. It was the kind of place where you half expected to see a ghost lurking around the corner. When I knocked on the door of the room, a man in his 40s answered. He had a strange look in his eyes, and I could tell that there was something off about him. He invited me inside to get my tip, but as soon as I stepped inside that room, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to leave, but the man grabbed me and dragged me into the bathroom. The room was small and dingy, with rusted pipes and broken tiles. I could see a bathtub in the corner, filled to the brim with a dark liquid that smelled putrid. "Do you know what this is?" the man asked, gesturing to the tub. I shook my head, trying to break free from his grip. "It's blood," he said, his eyes gleaming. "I need it. I have very important plans." I realized with horror that I was in the presence of someone truly insane, and I knew that I had to get out of there before it was too late. But that man was so strong. He held me in place as he chanted in a strange language. I noticed that his eyes were now closed, and he seemed truly engrossed in whatever it was he was saying, and so I took this opportunity to break free and run out of the bathroom. But as I fled, I heard the man yelling in anger, and I knew he wouldn't let me leave without a fight. As I ran through the motel hallway, I could hear the man's footsteps behind me. The hallway was dark and narrow, and I could barely see where I was going. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was sure that I was about to die if he caught me. But then I saw a glimmer of light in the distance. It was the door to the outside world, and I knew that I had to get there before he caught up to me. I ran as fast as I could, my heart beating faster and faster, but just as I reached the door, I felt a hand grab my shoulder. I screamed and pushed the door open, running into the night. As I sprinted away from the motel, I could see the man running with blood dripping from his hands. But luckily I could tell he was slowing down, and I just turned back around and kept sprinting. As I ran down the road, I looked back and saw that the man had in fact given up the chase. And so I just kept going until I eventually reached a main road. I flagged down a passing car and I explained what had happened. The driver was a middle-aged man with a kind face, and he offered to take me to the nearest police station. When we arrived, I told the officers everything that had happened, and they immediately dispatched a team to investigate the motel. Within less than an hour, they had apprehended the man, and managed to uncover a horrifying ritual chamber in his motel room. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for me, I quit my job as a pizza delivery driver and took some much-needed time off to recover from the traumatic experience. Years have now passed since that night, but I still think about it from time to time. It's a reminder that evil can lurk almost anywhere, and we should always trust our instincts. But either way, I'm so grateful for that kind stranger who helped me that night, because you never know. He may have been able to eventually catch up to me. I had finally done it. After years of saving, I had finally managed to save up enough money to take the plunge and go travelling in Australia. All those hours of overtime were about to pay off, and I couldn't have been more excited to start my real-life adventure. There was so much to look forward to. The wildlife, the people, the beautiful scenery. There's a reason why so many people choose to go to Australia to travel, and let me tell you, the first few weeks certainly didn't disappoint. That was until about a month into my trip, when I had an experience that still makes me shudder to this day when I think about it. It was the summer of 2013 when I kissed my family goodbye and set off for the land down under. They were sad to see me go, but they knew how long I had been planning this trip, so they were extremely supportive and looking forward to all of the photos and videos I would be taking. The plane journey wasn't the most comfortable. I'm not usually somebody who particularly likes small, cramped spaces, so sitting on a plane for more than 10 hours at a time was not an ideal situation. But I didn't care. It was all worth it. I had booked a hotel for the first week, just to give me time to find my feet, and then it was time to search for hostels. I'm not sure what the situation is now, but at the time, I wasn't able to book any places before I left, as most of the cheap hostels worked on a first-come, first-served basis. So, after a week in Sydney, taking lots of pictures and spending time with a few family friends that lived out there, I set off north with a target of reaching the famous Daintree rainforest within a couple of months. Part of the challenge for me was finding part-time work to pay my way, but unfortunately this meant that I couldn't be very picky as to who I worked with. A fact that would end up causing a lot more grief than I first expected. I managed to find a small farm slightly north of Sydney where I worked as a dairy farmhand. Essentially, I milked the cows and also looked after the chickens from time to time, which was a huge change from my basic carpentry job back in the UK. I loved it, but I knew this job couldn't last forever. I had to keep moving if I wanted to make it to the Daintree in time. So I said my goodbyes to the family I was staying with and set out to reach the next town over. They offered to give me a ride, but I turned them down as I wanted to make my own way. I saw relying on others for lifts as cheating pretty much, so I thanked them for the offer and headed off once again. This was my first mistake. I had a general idea of where I was going, but Australia is a lot bigger than you'd think. Well, to cut a long story short, it soon became abundantly clear that I had underestimated the walk to the next town, and I was beginning to feel the effects of dehydration. I had a small bottle of water in my backpack, but I had no idea how much longer the walk would be. I was already 2 hours behind schedule, and I didn't want to waste the little water I had left in case I would need to start rationing resources. I also hadn't seen a car for miles, and the sun was relentlessly beaming down on me. So I'd be lying if I didn't admit I was starting to panic. So there I was, walking down the side of a deserted road with only a single bottle of water left and no end in sight. I checked my phone in a hopeless attempt to see if I could get any kind of signal, but of course there was nothing. I thought about giving up and turning back around, but at this point I had been walking for about 5 hours, and so I assumed I would probably be better off continuing forward. I mean, surely I would stumble upon something soon. An abandoned gas station, a remote farm, anything. Well, after another hour or so, my prayers were finally answered, in the form of a run-down looking house with a broken metal fence surrounding the residence. It looked so out of place, like someone had just picked it up and planted it in the middle of nowhere. But I certainly wasn't in a position to be choosy, so I approached the metal gate that was hanging off its hinges. As I pushed the gate open, I heard a high-pitched squeak as it flew back and collided with the fence. I remember it was a lot lighter than I had first expected. I walked up to the front door and knocked 2 times. Even in my desperation, I still felt uncomfortable, and after I knocked, I kind of hoped nobody would be home. But then I heard footsteps coming from behind the door. They were loud, and I could tell whoever lived there was wearing metal-heeled boots from the sound they made as they hit the wooden floorboards. I stepped back as I could tell they were on the other side of the door, and I wanted to brace myself. I had certainly met many kind Australians so far on my trip, but also a fair share of not-so-nice individuals. So I had my guard up, and I was ready for anything at this point. The front door creaked open, and standing before me was a 6'4" behemoth of a man. He had one of those traditional Australian sun hats on his head, and a full beard that looked like it had never been groomed before. He didn't smile at me at all, and instead just grunted in my direction, as if to say, "What do you want?" I introduced myself and explained my situation, but he just huffed and said something under his breath. He had a very thick Australian accent, so there was no way I could decipher his mumblings. He stepped back and told me to come in. I was obviously hesitant at first, but again, I was stranded and had absolutely no idea how much longer it would be until I got to the next town. So I followed him inside, and he directed me to a room that contained just a single chair and a few tools scattered around on the floor. I sat down on the chair and awaited further instruction. He told me to wait there and left the room, leaving the door open. I remember feeling extremely uncomfortable at this point, but I was still somewhat optimistic that I would be okay. Despite his rough appearance and menacing demeanour, I got the impression he could just be a no-nonsense man. I mean, he could have just slammed the door in my face, right? As I sat there though, all of the possibilities started running through my mind. The longer he took to return, the more my imagination wandered, and I started to worry I might be in serious danger. Was I being naive? I was sitting in a complete stranger's home in the middle of nowhere, where nobody would hear my screams. Well, just as I began to gather my composure, ready to bolt out of that door, the man's unkempt face suddenly appeared at the door, holding a glass of water. I was so caught off guard. It was like he was waiting for me to make a move before he decided to appear. I stared at him with wide eyes as he walked closer and gestured for me to take the glass of water. Again, I was hesitant at first. My imagination had me worried that this drink might be poisoned or drugged, so I slowly took the glass from his hand, still assessing the situation. And then he muttered, "Well, aren't you going to drink it?" I looked back at him, and I really did not know what to do at this point. His face had now changed from a lifeless scowl to confusion, as he repeated himself, "Are you going to drink it then, or should I just pour it away?" His tone of voice had grown in aggression, and I instinctively raised the glass to my lips and started to sip the drink. As far as I could tell, it just tasted like water. It was warm, but nothing different to what I'd been drinking so far on my trip. I thanked him and apologized, explaining that I was delirious from the sun, and I'd been walking for hours. He again just huffed and muttered under his breath, no doubt something about how stupid travellers like me were. I asked him how far the next town over was, and he stared at me with an even more confused look on his face. Town? There's no town around here. I know there's a small farm about 5 hours that way, but the closest town is bloody miles away. I was shocked, and explained that I had just come from a small farm, and I'd been walking for at least 5 hours, and that's when I realised I had been going in the completely wrong direction this entire time. After I gave the man the name of the town I was heading for, he just laughed at me and left the room. He quickly returned with a book in hand and pointed at one of the pages. It was an atlas, and he was showing me where I currently was. It turned out that I had actually been walking west this whole time instead of north, and had ventured deep into the Australian outback. I was mortified to see this, but his menacing demeanour had completely changed as he started laughing hysterically to himself. I was still a bit shocked, but his laughter was infectious, and I eventually began to join in, as he put his hand on my shoulder. He called me a flamin' gala, and explained that I was lucky to have stumbled upon his house before a dingo got me. To this day, I don't know if he was just trying to scare me, or if he was being serious, but I just laughed, hoping he would take pity on me. Thankfully he did, and offered to let me stay for the night, and even prepared some resources for me to get back to the farm the next day. He said his car was being borrowed by a friend at the time, so he apologised for not being able to drive me back, but I was in no place to be making any demands. So again, I just thanked him profusely and headed back to the farm the next day. Once I arrived, the family were actually quite relieved. Apparently one of the kids saw me walking in the wrong direction after I left, but had only told his dad the next morning. So they were genuinely prepared to come out looking for me. Anyway, when they offered me a ride to the next town over a second time, they wouldn't take no for an answer. The rest of the trip had its ups and downs, but I did make it to the Daintree in time, which is the main thing. Unfortunately, there was another rather negative experience that happened whilst I was staying at one of the hostels, but perhaps that's a story for another day. Nevertheless, from this experience, I certainly learned an extremely valuable lesson. Never be too proud to accept help from others, especially when it comes to the Australian wilderness. I had always loved roller coasters. The rush of adrenaline you get when soaring high above the ground and then plunging back down at breakneck speeds. I mean, what's not to love? So when my parents surprised me with a trip to the new amusement park that had opened up on the outskirts of town, I was beyond excited. We arrived at the park early in the morning, the sun just starting to rise above the horizon. The park was still relatively empty, giving us plenty of time to explore before the crowds started pouring in. We made our way to the largest roller coaster in the park, a towering metal behemoth with twisting tracks that seemed to go on forever. We waited in line for what felt like hours, the anticipation building with every passing minute. Finally, we were strapped into our seats and the roller coaster began to ascend the first hill. As we reached the top, I could see the entire park spread out before me. The rides and attractions were now mere specks in the distance. But then, something went wrong. The coaster suddenly jolted to a stop, leaving us suspended at the very top of the ride. I felt sick as I looked down at the ground far below, now worried that I may be stuck. Suddenly I heard a strange sound coming from somewhere behind me. It was a low growl, deep and menacing, like nothing I had ever heard before. I turned my head to see where the sound was coming from, but there was nothing there. But that's when I saw it. A strange creature, unlike anything I had ever seen before, had appeared in the cart with us. Its skin was a sickly green, with bulging eyes and sharp, jagged teeth. It stared at us with a look of pure hatred, its gaze lingering on me for what felt like an eternity. I could feel its hot breath on my face, and I could smell the putrid stench emanating from its body. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The other passengers were equally terrified, paralyzed with fear, as the creature inched closer and closer to all of us. But just as it seemed like the creature was about to attack, the coaster suddenly lurched forward, hurtling us down the track at breakneck speed. Before I had a chance to even look, the creature had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But the image was still seared into my mind forever. We made it safely back to the platform, where park staff quickly ushered us off the ride and led us to a quiet corner of the park. They assured us that there was just a glitch in the system, and that it wouldn't happen again. But something about the way they took us aside made me feel quite strange. Well, after the park staff left, we all stayed put, talking and discussing what we had seen. Since that day, I have never been back to that amusement park again, and I'll never forget the strange creature that appeared on the roller coaster. I still wonder if it was some kind of incredible 3D effect, but to this day I've never heard of a roller coaster that has anything remotely similar to what I experienced. So it's difficult for me to move on, when I don't really understand what happened. Even now, years later, the image of its bulging eyes and razor-sharp teeth haunts me in my dreams, and I don't know if I will ever, truly, move on. I had always dreamed of visiting Paris, the city of love and romance. So when I finally saved up enough money to go on a vacation, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. But little did I know that my dream vacation would soon turn into a nightmare that I would never forget. As soon as I arrived in Paris, I was mesmerized by the beauty of the city. I spent my days exploring the famous landmarks such as the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre Museum. I even took a romantic boat ride on the Seine River with my boyfriend who had come on this trip with me. But on the 4th day of our vacation, that's when things started to take a dark turn. We were walking through a quiet hallway when we saw a man staring at us from the shadows. He was tall and lean, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes. He was dressed in rags, and his hair was matted and greasy. We just assumed he must be a homeless person, and we quickened our pace, trying to ignore him. But we noticed that he was following us. We turned around and saw that he was getting closer, his eyes fixed on us, so we started to run. Luckily, we were able to lose him when we ducked into a crowded cafe. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. That night, we went to a local restaurant for dinner. The food was delicious, but as soon as we finished eating, we both started to feel sick. We thought it was just a case of food poisoning, but the symptoms were rather strange. We were both having hallucinations, and we couldn't remember what had happened during the night. The next day we decided to take a walk in a local park. It was a beautiful day with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze. But as we walked, we noticed that that same man from the alleyway was following us again. He was always just a few steps behind us, and we could always feel his presence. We tried to shake him off by walking faster and changing directions, but again, he kept following us. It started to seem like there was nothing we could do, so we started to panic and ran back to our hotel, locking the door behind us. We were kept up that night with strange noises coming from outside the door, like someone was walking back and forth. We tried to ignore it, but the sound kept getting louder. But then we heard a voice whispering in French, which sounded something like "Je suis là," which roughly translates to "I am here." We didn't know what to make of it, but the rest of the night was a blur. We don't even remember how we got out of the hotel room the next day. Well, we decided to go straight to the police station to report what had happened, but they seemed very disinterested and brushed us off. They told us that it was probably just a case of too much alcohol, and that we shouldn't worry about it, but we knew something was wrong. Well, for the next few days we were able to avoid any trouble, and we actually started to have a good time. So much so that we decided to visit the famous catacombs of Paris, a network of underground tunnels lined with human bones. My boyfriend is more the macabre type, and this was one of the main reasons we had actually come to Paris. To be fair, it was a popular tourist attraction, and I thought it would be a good way to take our minds off the strange events of the past few days. But as we descended deeper into the tunnels, that's when we started to hear those same strange noises. It sounded like someone was whispering in our ears, and we could feel cold breath on our necks. We tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched was far too strong. And then we saw that same man from the alleyway. He was standing in front of us with a very creepy expression on his face. He started to walk towards us, his steps echoing in the dark tunnel. We tried to run, but the tunnels were too narrow and too dark, so we stumbled and fell, scraping our knees and elbows on the rough walls. All the while, the man was getting closer, his footsteps growing louder. But then we saw a glimmer of light in the distance. It was a group of tourists led by a guide, so we screamed for help, and the guide quickly came to our rescue. As the guide approached us, however, the man ran away, but at least we finally felt safe. Well, safe to say, we left Paris the very next day, grateful to be alive, but still haunted by the memories of that nightmare. We never found out what happened to us, really, but all I know is that I'll never forget the terror that I experienced in the so-called City of Love. Back in the summer of 2008, my family had planned a vacation to Shadowland, a brand new theme park that had recently opened up in my home state of Oregon. It had been a tough year with my dad losing his job, but things were starting to look up after he managed to find some work on a construction site. So, despite the recession at the time, we were just about able to afford this trip. But little did I know that I would see something on this trip that would still haunt me over a decade later. I still remember, as we drove through the winding roads that led to the park, I was so excited, but to be honest, I was also a bit nervous. It didn't help that the forest around us was thick and dark, with the trees casting long shadows that almost seemed to reach out and grab us. But as we approached the park's entrance, my fear quickly turned into fascination. The park was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was absolutely huge, and you could see roller coasters spilling out of the site. The entrance was marked by a giant archway that glowed with a bright welcome sign, and as soon as we stepped through, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy hit me almost immediately. Even my parents were giddy with excitement, eager to explore the park and try out all the rides. My younger brother was jumping up and down with anticipation, but as we made our way through the different sections of the park, I had this strange feeling that something was watching us. It's hard to describe, but I just found it really difficult to enjoy myself after that, as there was this dark cloud in my mind. The park was divided into different sections, each with its own unique theme. The first section we visited was called the Haunted Woods. It was filled with trees that looked as if they were dead, and the paths were lined with eerie lanterns that flickered in the wind. The rides were all designed to scare you. There was a haunted house that promised to be the scariest in the world, a roller coaster that went through a graveyard, and even a Ferris wheel that stopped at the top to give you a bird's eye view of the park. But the most unsettling thing about the Haunted Woods was the woman with black eyes. She seemed to be following us wherever we went, her eyes fixed on me. She was tall and thin, with long black hair that seemed to flow in the wind. She wore a long black dress and her skin was pale, almost translucent. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, just waiting for something. But I remember at first trying to convince myself she was just part of the theme park, and it was all just an act. Anyway, we moved on to the next section, This one was called the Dark Circus. This area was filled with clowns, but they weren't the kind you would see at a normal circus. They had twisted smiles and sharp teeth, and their eyes seemed to follow you wherever you went. The rides in this section were even more terrifying. There was a spinning ride that made you feel like you were being thrown around by an actual clown, a roller coaster that went through a clown's mouth, and also a house of mirrors that distorted your reflection, but in the most unsettling way. As we walked through the dark circus, I couldn't help but feel like we were being led somewhere. I mean, the woman with black eyes was always there, watching us from a distance. Her eyes seemed to glow in the dark, and I could see her long, bony fingers twitching as if she was eager to grab me. We then moved on to the next section, the Twilight Zone. This area was filled with strange and otherworldly rides. There was a maze that promised to take you to another dimension. This spinning ride that made you feel like you were floating in space. And of course, a haunted hotel that promised to give you nightmares for weeks. It was here that I had the most terrifying encounter with the woman with black eyes. We were on a ride that took us through a dark tunnel, and I saw her, standing at the end of it. She was staring right at me, her eyes glowing with a strange light. As we got closer, I could see that she was holding something in her hand, a black, twisted object that for the life of me, I couldn't seem to identify. I screamed, but no one else seemed to notice her. My parents told me that I was just imagining things, but I knew what I had seen. We then moved on to the final section of the park, the Gates of Hell. In terms of the actual sections to the park, this one was probably the scariest of all, with rides that promised to take you to the darkest corners of your soul. There was a ride that made you feel like you were falling into a pit of fire, and a haunted mansion that promised to be the most terrifying experience of your life. But despite my usually darker nature, I couldn't enjoy any of it. The woman with black eyes was always there, watching me from a distance. I could feel her presence everywhere, and I knew that she was waiting for me. It wasn't until we were about to leave the park that things took a turn for the worse. I had to use the restroom, and my mum told me to go ahead while they waited outside. I made my way to the bathroom, feeling a sense of unease creeping over me. It was empty, and as I stood in front of the sink washing my hands, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around, and there she was, standing in the doorway. She took a step towards me, and I screamed, backing away from her. I tried to run, but she grabbed me, her fingers digging into my skin. I kicked and fought, but she was too strong. And then, suddenly, my mum was there, pulling her off of me. We ran out of the bathroom, and I didn't stop until we were safely back in the car. I never went back to Shadowland again, and I never forgot the woman with the black eyes. To this day, I still don't know if she was part of the theme park, or if she was just some strange woman taking advantage of the situation, but I do know that I will never forget the terror that I felt that day. "5 years down the drain, and you know what? I couldn't have been happier. Now, at this time, I had been planning my dream vacation to the Bahamas for months, and I was supposed to be going with my boyfriend. The problem was, a few weeks before the trip, we kind of broke up. Well, despite the heartbreak, I decided to go on the trip alone, but I certainly didn't mind. To be honest, when we were together, I would always have to go on long hikes and pretend to be amazed by boring sightseeing. So I was quite looking forward to just relaxing on the beach with a cocktail. When I got off that plane, I still remember the warm air immediately hitting me, which filled me with such excitement, a feeling which unfortunately only lasted a few days, as by the fourth night, I wished I'd never even got on that plane. The first few days went pretty smoothly. I soaked up the sun on the beach, ate delicious seafood, and even explored the local markets. I was staying in a small bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town. The place was small but cosy nonetheless, but I must say, it did have quite a strange energy about it. The walls were thin and I could hear every creak and groan of the old building. The staff seemed friendly enough, but there was something off about them, like they were trying way too hard. It was difficult to put my finger on what it was from what they would say exactly. It was more the tone in their voice. But either way, whenever I'd finish speaking to any of them, I'd always be left with a feeling of nervousness that lingered in my mind. Well, this feeling built up as the days passed, and it was on that fateful fourth night where I suddenly woke up to use the bathroom. This was already kind of strange, as I'm usually one to sleep right through the night, especially after I've had a few drinks, so I was already slightly confused as to why I was awake. Nevertheless, I listened to my body and headed for the bathroom. But as I was washing my hands, I heard a faint whisper coming from the other side of the door. It sounded like someone was quietly speaking in a foreign language. I froze, my heart racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I tried to listen closer, but the sound faded away. I told myself it was just one of the other guests speaking in their room and the thin walls were allowing me to hear them. So I just laid back down on my bed. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I heard the whispering once again. But this time, it was louder, and I could swear I heard multiple voices. It sounded almost like they were trying not to be heard. I sat up in bed, and I reached for the phone to call the front desk, but the line was dead. As I hung up the phone, slamming it down in frustration, the talking suddenly stopped. The room fell deadly silent. I just sat there in the darkness, my breaths coming in short gasps, listening for any signs of life. And then I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the door. In that moment, I truly feared that someone was trying to break in. I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream, but I was too afraid to make a sound. But after a few more seconds of persistent scratching, the sound abruptly stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. I tried a few more times to call the front desk, but every time, I was met with that same tone of a dead phone line. I can still hear it now, ringing in my ears, the sound now representing true horror in my mind. It honestly gives me goosebumps even now, if I ever hear that tone. Anyway, the next morning I went to the front desk to report the noises that I'd heard during the night, plus the broken phone. But when I tried to explain it to the staff, they just looked at me blankly. They didn't seem to understand what I was saying, despite understanding me perfectly the previous few days. I insisted that the phone was not working properly, so one of them followed me to the room to see for themselves. They tried calling the front desk from my bedroom, and to my surprise, it went through just fine. I was skeptical at first, and so asked if I could see for myself. The staff member stared at me with a look of confusion and a hint of anger as he handed me the phone. But to my astonishment, I heard the front desk staff on the other end of that line. Well, I apologised and thanked them for helping me, but deep down, I was still way too uncomfortable staying in that room another night. So I packed up my things and checked out shortly after, determined to find somewhere safer to stay. But to my horror, no matter where I stayed, the nightmares continued. Every night I would hear shouting outside my door. I would always wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that someone was in the room with me. I genuinely started to feel like I was losing my mind. I was honestly now at the point of just returning home because I was so exhausted. It had gotten so bad that I was literally terrified to go to sleep at night, afraid that whatever was making those sounds would finally get me. There was a constant battle going on in my mind, trying to decide if I was crazy or if what I was experiencing was real. Well, as much as I wish I had just returned home right then and there, something compelled me to stay. I don't know if I was still drunk from the margaritas, or maybe I just wanted to prove to everybody that I was capable of going on a holiday by myself. But whichever one it was, the fact is, I stayed, determined to finish this holiday as planned. I decided to treat myself for the final night of my trip. I had already pre-booked a room at a 5-star hotel, as I wanted to end the vacation with a bang. And that's exactly what happened, but not in the way that I had expected. It was around 10 o'clock at night when I decided to take a walk on the beach to clear my head. It was a beautiful night. The stars were out and the moon was full, but as I walked, I noticed something strange. There were no other people around. It was like the entire island was deserted. Now, I hadn't visited the Bahamas during a particularly popular season, but in all of my time here, I was yet to experience such isolation. I mean, the only sound I could hear was of the waves. It was kind of peaceful actually, come to think of it. Until it wasn't. I saw an upside-down boat, kind of like a large canoe, just randomly out in the middle of the beach, and it was getting very close to the tide. I wondered if there was anybody over there, as I saw a few bottles on the sand scattered around. Well, naturally, I was curious, and so slowly approached the boat, trying to keep a careful distance so I could see if there was anybody there. As I got closer, I peered around the side of the boat, and I saw a man, just staring out into the water, not moving a muscle. At first I was quite startled. His face was menacing, but through the darkness I could just about make out a lifeless gaze. It suddenly dawned on me that this man could be in serious danger, or something even worse. I crept up to him, cautiously knocking on the boat in an attempt to get his attention. At first there was no reaction, and then suddenly he turned his head to face me, his face now twice as menacing, and his eyes now bursting with life. He quickly jumped to his feet, with a look I can only describe as devious. I suddenly started to feel sick. I knew this man was not right in the head. The way his body stood in a lopsided stance made him seem almost inhuman. I screamed as he approached me, and I started to run in the opposite direction, but the sand made it so hard to run. He started to chase me, and I instinctively threw the pair of sandals I was holding back at him, but it didn't slow him down, not one bit. I could hear the man chasing me, and I could feel the sand hitting the back of my legs as he got closer. I took one last look back, desperately hoping that he wouldn't be as close as I thought. But there he was, his arms pumping erratically, and his eyes transfixed on mine. Without a second thought, I turned back and tried to speed up, but as my feet moved faster than my legs, I stumbled and fell, painfully twisting my ankle and falling to the ground. I yelled out in hysterical pain as the realization of the situation had sunken in. In that moment, I genuinely thought my life was over. But as I looked up, expecting the worst, I saw a figure racing off in the distance as my vision began to blur. I could feel myself starting to faint from the pain, but I knew what dark possibilities may be waiting for me if I allowed myself to become an unconscious girl on an isolated beach. So I pushed myself harder than I ever had before, slowly rising to my feet. My ankle felt like it was on fire, and I was in such immense pain, but I knew I only had one option, which was to get the hell out of there and try and find help. I made my way back to the boardwalk and dragged my mangled leg as far as I could go in the direction of civilization. I was still so scared that the man would return, but I kept moving and eventually managed to stumble upon a private hotel. It was locked up for the night, but I could see that there were lights on in the lobby. I screamed at the top of my lungs, hoping that someone would hear me. And to my luck, a surprised-looking security guard appeared at the door, with his hands cupping the window as he peered out in my direction. Once he realized what was happening, he opened the door and quickly approached me. I told him everything that had happened, and given that I certainly didn't look like one of the locals pulling a fast one, he seemed to believe me and opened the gates. I asked him if I could call the police, but he told me he had already called his friend who was a policeman that happened to be on shift that night. They were so wonderful. They really took care of me and even drove me to the local hospital. Apparently the man was likely just a local homeless guy who was taking advantage of the situation. They told me I was really stupid for walking alone at night on the beach, and that I was lucky that I managed to escape with just a twisted ankle. I remember feeling like this was the first time on this vacation that I felt like I was truly speaking to somebody that cared. Once I warmed up to the hospital staff, I asked them if they knew what the sounds were that I was hearing during the night. Well, they even had an answer to this too. Apparently, there were a lot of gangs in the same area as my bed and breakfast was located, so the sounds were likely nefarious in nature. The gang members like to take advantage of naive tourists, and sometimes they even pay off the hotel staff to get access to certain rooms. When I heard this news, I was truly terrified. I had stayed in multiple hotels during my stay, but they were always in the same dangerous area. Looking back, it almost feels like I was playing Russian roulette with my own life, jumping from place to place, widening the odds that I eventually come face to face with one of these criminals. Well, I ended up staying the night in the hospital, and luckily, after calling the hotel and speaking to the hotel staff, they kindly packed up my things and hand-delivered them to me. I was grateful, and still am. That nightmare holiday actually had quite a happy ending, and I left feeling an immense sense of relief. But that doesn't mean I don't regret going on that vacation. As much as I appreciate life now, I still struggle to sleep at night. I am incredibly oversensitive to sound, and I now have an irrational fear of the beach. I'm sure I will carry the weight of that experience with me forever. But I hope my story can be a message to any other girls out there that are determined to go on holidays by themselves. I understand, but it's a cruel world out there, and you never know what might be waiting for you, even in a tropical paradise. I always loved spending time in my garden. It was my very own little oasis, a place where I could escape from the stress of everyday life and immerse myself in the beauty of nature. But everything changed in that one night. I remember I was out in my garden, admiring the stars, when I suddenly saw something move out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it must have been a deer or a raccoon, but as I turned to get a better look, I realized that it was something else entirely. Standing in the middle of my garden was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was tall and slender, and had skin that shimmered in the moonlight. Its limbs were long and thin, and the best way I can describe it is that it looked almost like a humanoid praying mantis. I stood there in my garden, frozen, unable to move or speak, as the creature slowly approached me. I could feel its eyes boring into my soul, studying me. And then, out of nowhere, I felt a sudden jolt of pain in my head, as if someone had flicked a switch in my brain. My thoughts had become fuzzy, and my vision blurry. I stumbled backwards, unable to maintain my balance. And then everything went black. Once I eventually came to, I found myself lying on the ground, surrounded by the strange, otherworldly flora that had now sprung up around me. I felt groggy and disoriented, as if I had been asleep for days. I heard a sound. It was a low, rumbling hum, like the sound of 1,000 bees buzzing in unison. I looked up and saw a creature hovering above me, its limbs outstretched as if it were about to embrace me. I tried to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but it was as if I was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare world with no way to escape. The creature descended, its shimmering skin still glinting in the moonlight. Its eyes met mine, and I felt a sense of overwhelming dread wash over me. I knew that I was in the presence of something quite powerful. It stared at me for a while, before suddenly the creature vanished, leaving me alone on my garden floor. At first I just laid there, still trying to come to terms with what had just happened to me. But eventually I finally found the strength to get up, and I stumbled back into my house, my mind racing with many questions. What had that creature just done to me? Had it taken something from me? And the most important question, was I still in danger? Well, over the next few days, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that that creature was still out there, somewhere, waiting for its next move, and I would always notice strange things happening around my house that I couldn't explain. For example, my phone would ring, but when I answered, there was no one on the other end. My TV would flicker on and off, even when I had turned it off before going to bed. And worst of all, I began to have vivid nightmares about that creature. Dreams where it would visit me in my room, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I couldn't tell anyone about this. What would they think? So I began to research, determined to find any way to protect myself against whatever that creature was. I lived in fear for a while after that, never knowing when he may strike. But all of my anticipation suddenly came to a head when I looked out my window one night to see that very same creature crawling around on the grass. I instinctively ran to my closet and grabbed a baseball bat, ready to defend myself and to deal with this creature once and for all. But when I turned back to face the window, the creature was gone. I walked out into the garden and searched the area, but there was no sign of it, and yet I knew that it was still out there. Well, safe to say, From that moment on, I was never the same. And even now, years later, I can still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the veil of reality, waiting for its chance to strike once more. It was the first Friday in October, and I was standing outside Thorpe Park's entrance, anxiously waiting for my friends to arrive. The park is famous for its Fright Night events, and I was excited to experience all the scary mazes and attractions that they would have on offer. I had heard that they went all out for the events, with actors dressed as zombies, ghosts, and other creepy characters lurking around every corner. It was supposed to be the ultimate Halloween experience. As soon as my friends arrived, we headed straight for the first maze. The line was long, but we were all hyped up and eager to get started. We finally made our way through the entrance and into the maze. It was dark and the air was thick with a fog. We could hear screams and eerie noises coming from all directions. My heart was pounding and my palms were sweating. It was all so intense and so real. As we made our way through the maze, I noticed one of the actors was dressed as a clown, with a white and red outfit and face paint that made him look even more sinister. He had a red balloon in his hand and was staring at me intently. His eyes were piercing, and I felt like he was staring right into my soul. It was unnerving, but I tried to shake it off, thinking that it was just all part of the experience. But as we exited the maze, I noticed the same actor following us out. He was still holding the red balloon and was now walking faster, trying to keep up with our pace. I watched as he stalked us from a distance, his eyes never leaving us. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I knew something was definitely off. Feeling uneasy, I suggested that we move on to the next maze, but as we made our way there, I felt like we were being followed once again. I turned around and saw the same actor from before, but this time he was much closer, his eyes only locked on me. I tried to keep calm and told my friends to quicken their pace, but I could feel his presence right behind me the whole way. And then suddenly, I felt a pair of hands grab me from behind. It was the clown actor, and he had snuck up on me with his hands tightly gripping my arms. My friends tried to pull me away, but the actor was too strong. I was struggling to break free, my heart racing, when I heard a loud commotion coming from the other side of the maze. Other actors dressed as zombies and ghosts had come to our rescue. They were yelling and pushing the clown actor away from us, using their fake weapons to keep him at bay. The actor seemed to snap out of his daze and started to fight back, but the other actors managed to subdue him and take him away. We were all in shock and had to be escorted out of the park. I couldn't believe that such a terrifying experience had happened to me. It all felt so real, so intense. I was shaking, and I couldn't stop crying. The authorities later revealed that the actor who had attacked us was a psychopath who had infiltrated the event to cause harm. He wasn't actually an actor in the park, and he had a history of violence. It was a wake-up call for the park and for all of us who thought that we were in a safe place. I never went back to Thorpe Park after that incident. The memory of his face still haunts me to this day, and I still get chills whenever I think back to that night. It's a reminder that even in places that are supposed to be safe and fun, danger can always lurk in the shadows. It was finally the summer holidays, and my friend and I had planned to visit the Disneyland in Hong Kong for a day as a mini celebration. It was supposed to be the best day of my life, as I'm a huge Disney fan, and I had always wanted to go to Disneyland one day. But unfortunately, this day suddenly took a dark turn when I got on the bus that morning. I still remember sitting at the back of the bus, listening to Disney music, feeling so excited for the day, thinking about all the rides that I wanted to go on and all the merchandise that I wanted to buy. I was planning to meet my friend at the front gates as we lived on opposite sides of the city. But once the bus stopped to pick up some passengers, that's when I first noticed a foreign man getting onto the bus. We caught eyes for a second, and he sat down on the opposite chair that was facing me. I didn't think too much about it at first, and was just about to drift back into my mind, imagining how the day was going to be, when, all of a sudden, I saw a hand waving, blocking the view of my phone. It was that foreign man who had just sat down in front of me, and he was smiling politely, and I could lip read him saying, "Hello." I took off my earphones and politely answered, yes? I figured he must be travelling in Hong Kong and needed my help for directions or something, as the bus was, at the time, heading towards a tourist attraction area. But to my surprise, he told me I looked really pretty and would like to have a chat with me. I was honestly so caught off guard by what he said, as I've never considered myself as a pretty girl, and certainly never expected to be approached by a complete stranger telling me that I am in fact pretty. I didn't know how to react, or what to say, so I simply just said thank you and awkwardly smiled back. But that's when the innocent conversation started to take a weird turn. He began to ask me some questions. At first they were more generic, like, are you local, or what restaurants would you recommend, just stuff like that. But then the questions started to get a bit more personal, like, where do you live, how old are you, where are you going right now, and the worst one of all, do you have a boyfriend? Well, being the innocent girl I was before, I kind of felt bad for ignoring him, so I started giving him fake answers in the hopes that I wouldn't give out any private information about myself. But after answering a few more questions, that's when he told me he needed to get off at the next bus stop. I instantly felt a great sense of relief, as I was feeling quite awkward with him asking me all of these questions, and I was looking forward to being left alone. But as I prepared myself to say goodbye, he suddenly asked for my phone number. And this is the part of the story that I truly regret the most. I did consider giving him a fake number, but I was overthinking the situation. What if he called me straight away to see if I'd given him my real number or not? And what if he then got aggressive once he found out I gave him a fake number? So, although I hate to admit it, I did end up giving him my real phone number. Anyway, he got off the bus and I met up with my friend in Disneyland as planned. We had the most wonderful time, and I really did enjoy every minute of that day, and had almost forgotten about the awkward conversation on the bus. But my high spirits were immediately crushed when I checked my phone as we were leaving the park. I saw that a random number had sent me a few messages. I instantly remembered it must be from that foreign guy on the bus, who I'd stupidly given my number to earlier that day. I remember I was still a bit weary of that encounter, so at first I ignored the messages and put my phone away. But when I checked my phone again later that night, when I arrived home, I saw a few more messages from him, with one particular message catching my eye. He said that he remembered me mentioning how much I loved music, and so he attached a video asking, "Do you like this music video that I made?" To be honest, I was actually quite intrigued and genuinely thought he had written a song for me. So I opened the video, which I now wish I never had done. It was a video featuring extremely inappropriate content, and I was really scared and shaken up after seeing it. I literally threw my phone onto my bed once I realised what the video was, and started crying my eyes out. You know, I have never actually told anybody about this, as I felt really ashamed and stupid for even talking to that stranger and giving him my phone number. Now, I know it wasn't my fault, but I can't help but feel like I did contribute to the situation in some way. But either way, after this experience, I'm always super alert now, whenever I feel an uncomfortable presence. So please, learn from my mistakes, and just be safe out there. I've always been a darker person, fascinated by abandoned places and the idea of exploring them at night. So when my friends suggested that we explore an abandoned theme park, I jumped at the opportunity. We arrived at the park just as the sun began to set. It looked eerie, with rusted gates and broken down rides. At the time, I'm pretty sure it had been abandoned for around 10 years. There were a few rumours going around, but none of us really knew why it shut down in the first place. All we knew was that the silence was deafening as we walked through the empty paths within its walls. As we approached the old Ferris wheel, I could have sworn that I heard the faint sound of children laughing. I looked to my friends, but they didn't seem to notice it, so I brushed it off, thinking it must just be my imagination. But then I heard the sound even louder this time, and everybody looked at each other. Without saying a word, we followed the laughter to the Ferris wheel, but there was nobody there. As we continued through the park, we would hear strange noises coming from different attractions within the park. We would always hesitate, but our curiosity got the best of us, and we decided to investigate. There was this one building, and inside the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air was so musty. We could hear what sounded like footsteps coming from upstairs, but we just assumed it must be rats or something, as nobody could be up there. But then suddenly, we heard the sound of a door creaking open. We all looked at each other, wondering who or what could be opening that door. This is when we decided to creep up the stairs, and as we reached the top, a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind us. We were now trapped, left alone with the footsteps which were now getting closer. Panic started to set in as we tried to open the door, but failed miserably. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and as I turned around, I saw a figure in the darkness, its eyes glowing red. We could do nothing but run around in the room screaming for help, but of course, nobody came. Eventually, one of my friends started ramming himself against the door, and soon we all joined in, managing to break down the door and sprinting out of that building as fast as we could. We ran towards the entrance to the park, but just before we jumped over the gates, we looked back, and that's when we saw it, a ghostly figure standing in front of one of the attractions, staring directly at us. Its face was contorted in an expression of anger and hatred, and its eyes were a deep shade of black. We were all frozen with fear, unable to move or speak, despite us all wanting to just get the hell out of there. And that's when the figure started to move towards us, its arms outstretched. We could hear its raspy breaths getting closer and closer, and the hairs on the back of our necks stood on end. But then, just as it was about to reach us, the figure vanished into thin air. It felt almost like a warning, and we were left shaken and terrified. Well, eventually we managed to gain enough courage to just climb over the gate and leave, but as we left the park, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The experience has left us all traumatized, and we never really speak of it. I guess we got what we went there for, because the abandoned theme park had really lived up to its haunted reputation. I had been looking forward to my vacation at the luxurious resort for months. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, but I never imagined that it would turn into a real-life nightmare. As soon as I arrived at the resort, I was greeted by the friendly staff and taken to my room. It was breathtaking, with a balcony that overlooked the sparkling blue ocean. I settled in and spent the first day relaxing by the pool, sipping on a fruity cocktail and soaking up the sun. But I think it was the second day where things started to get weird. I was lounging by the pool when I noticed a man staring at me. He looked like he was tall and he had very dark hair. He was wearing a pair of sunglasses at the time, but I could tell he was looking directly at me. I felt so uneasy and quickly looked away. But that night, I went to the resort's restaurant for dinner. I ordered a steak, but when it arrived, it was undercooked and very bloody. I called the waiter over to complain, but he just shrugged and told me that that was how the chef had prepared it. Well, I wasn't in the mood for an argument, so I just continued with my dinner. Afterwards, I went back to my room and tried to get some sleep, but I kept hearing strange noises coming from the hallway. It sounded like someone was walking back and forth outside my door. I tried to ignore it, but the sound kept getting louder and more persistent. The next day, I decided to take a walk on the beach. It was a beautiful day, with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze. But as I walked, I noticed the same man from the pool following me. He was walking a few paces behind me, but I could feel his presence. I tried to shake him off by walking faster and changing directions, but he kept following me. I started to panic and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. That night I heard the same strange noises in the hallway, but this time they were accompanied by a faint tapping sound on my window. I cautiously approached the window and saw the man from the pool staring deep into my eyes. I screamed and ran to the phone to call the front desk, but to my dismay, the line was dead. I tried to leave my room, but the doorknob wouldn't budge. The tapping on the window grew louder and more persistent. I could see that man's face twisted into a menacing grin. But then, almost out of nowhere, the tapping stopped. Again, I cautiously approached the window, expecting to see him. But, to my luck, I saw that the man was now gone. For a moment I was able to relax, but as soon as I turned around, I saw a figure standing in the corner of my room. But it wasn't who you might expect. Instead, it was a woman with long black hair and very pale skin. She was wearing a dress and staring directly at me. Again I screamed and backed away, but the woman just stood there, staring. And then, almost as quickly as she had appeared, she disappeared into thin air. The rest of the night was a blur. I don't remember how I got out of the room, but I woke up on the beach the next morning, covered in sand and bruises. I stumbled back to the resort, my mind racing with questions. What had happened to me? Who were those people, and why did they target me? I went straight to the front desk and demanded an explanation. but the staff just looked at me with blank faces and told me that they had no record of any incidents or disturbances during the night. I was really starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by stress or exhaustion? But then I noticed a small slip of paper on the ground. It was folded neatly and had my name written on it in elegant script. I unfolded it and read the message inside. "We're watching you, and we're not done yet." My blood ran cold. That man and woman must have been real, and they were still out there. After that, I had to leave the resort and get as far away as possible, so I packed my bags and headed for the airport, keeping a lookout for any signs of the man or woman. But I still remember, just as I boarded my plane, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Leaving so soon?" the man said, his eyes locked on mine. I froze, unable to move or even scream. This nightmare was far from over. I stumbled to my feet and looked around, disoriented. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft glow over the beach. I saw footprints leading away from me, and realized that someone had carried me here. I started to feel a wave of nausea and dizziness wash over me. It was almost impossible to shake it off, but I tried my best and walked back to the resort again. But my legs felt like they were made of lead. I had absolutely no idea what had happened to me. I mean, the last thing I remember was boarding the plane, yet here I was, still at the resort. When I finally made it back to my room, I collapsed onto the bed and tried to collect my thoughts. I didn't know who to turn to or what to do. I mean, last time the front desk staff weren't exactly very helpful, and I had no way of explaining what had happened to me. And to be honest, I didn't want to draw any unwanted attention to myself. I just spent the rest of the day holed up in my room, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't leave until it was time for dinner, and even then I was nervous and jittery. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the man from the pool, or maybe even that woman wearing the dress. But the dinner was surprisingly uneventful. The food was cooked to perfection this time, and the waitstaff were attentive and polite. I actually started to relax a little, thinking that maybe everything was going to be okay. Well, that was until I returned to my room. As soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was different. The air felt thick and heavy, like a storm was brewing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that all of my belongings had been slightly moved. My clothes were no longer in the dresser, my toiletries were no longer in the bathroom, and my phone was nowhere to be found. I frantically searched the room, hoping that I had just misplaced everything, but as I dug through my luggage, I found something that made my heart stop. It was a note, written in scrawled handwriting. It read, "Leave before it's too late. You're not safe here." I tried to stay calm and rationalize everything. I mean, maybe someone was playing a sick joke on me. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I heard a knock on the door. I froze, not knowing what to do. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. But finally, I mustered up the courage to approach the door. I hesitantly asked who was there, but there was no response, just more knocking. I realized that I had to get out of there, no matter what, so I grabbed my purse and bolted out of the room, not even bothering to look back or pack any other bags. As I ran down the hallway, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't know who or what was chasing me, but I knew that I had to keep going. I stumbled down the stairs and burst out of the front door, gasping for air. And that's when I saw the woman in the dress again. She was standing at the edge of the property, staring at me with those same piercing eyes. She started walking towards me. I sprinted down the beach, my heart pounding, and I didn't stop until I was miles away from the resort, and even then, I didn't feel safe. Well, I eventually made it back to the plane, but luckily this time, I was able to fly back home. I will never be able to forget what happened to me on that trip. To be honest, I've never been on another vacation since, but I still have nightmares about that resort, and I'm sure I always will. It was a bright and sunny day when my friends and I decided to visit the theme park in our town. We were all excited to ride the roller coasters and play the games, and as soon as we entered the park, I could feel the adrenaline rush through my veins. We started off with some of the milder rides to warm up, and then moved on to the bigger ones. The screams and laughter from the other visitors filled the air and added to the excitement of the day. I was having the time of my life, until I noticed that person in an animal costume. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, but then I saw the same animal everywhere I went. I brushed it off as a weird coincidence, but as the day went on, I started to feel very uneasy. It was like I was being watched by whoever was in that costume, and it was making me incredibly uncomfortable. I tried to just shake the feeling off, but the stalker kept appearing around every corner. I could smell the musty odor coming from the costume, and it made me nauseous. When I listened carefully, I could even hear the sound of the stalker's heavy breathing and footsteps, which made my heart race with fear. It was like whenever I was alone, the stalker was there, and he would progressively get closer and closer to me. It was like he was intentionally trying to intimidate me. Well, once I was back with my friends, I finally decided to confront him and ask him why he was following me. But as I turned around, I was met with a blank stare from inside the animal mask. The stalker didn't say a word, but I could feel the tension in the air. At this point, I knew I had to get away, so I tried to lose him by going on some of the rides and hiding in the crowds, but somehow he always seemed to find me. It was almost like the more I tried to get away from him, the more persistent he became. As the sun started to set, the park began to empty out, and I noticed that the stalker had started to become more aggressive. His breathing had become substantially heavier, and I knew that I had to do something. So I ran towards the nearest security officer, but just before I could reach him, the stalker grabbed me. He then dragged me away down what looked like a dark alleyway within the theme park, and locked me in a storage room. I remember the room was pitch black, and I could feel my heart pounding as I screamed for help, but the stalker had tied a cloth around my mouth, muffling my screams. I could smell the musty scent of the animal costume mixed with the stalker's sweat. I was truly trapped in there, and time was passing by so slowly. I was so convinced that this was the end. Suddenly I heard the sound of the door open, and I looked up to see the outline of a security officer in the doorway. He quickly untied me. I was shaking and crying, but the security officer assured me that I was now safe. Apparently they had caught the man, and he was later identified as a former park employee who had been fired for inappropriate behaviour. Well, I did survive that day, but the experience has truly left me traumatised, and I never want to visit that theme park again, no matter what. I had always dreamed of visiting a tropical island with its white sandy beaches and crystal clear waters. So when my friend invited me to join her on a trip to a secluded island in the Pacific, I jumped at the chance. I remember we arrived at the island on a small propeller plane, landing on a runway that was barely visible from the air. As we stepped off the plane, the heat hit us like a wall. We were greeted by a man in a straw hat and a colourful shirt, who introduced himself as our guide. The island was everything I had hoped for, and more. The beaches were pristine, with turquoise waters that sparkled in the sun. It even had a forest that was dense and lush, filled with exotic plants and animals. I swear, it was paradise on earth. But after a few days, our trip took a turn, for the worse. It all started with a strange feeling of being watched everywhere we went. It felt like someone was following us, watching us from the shadows. My friend dismissed it as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about this island. That night, we heard a strange noise coming from the forest. It sounded like a mix of howling or growling like nothing I'd ever heard before. My friend tried to reassure me, but I could tell she was a little bit scared too. The next day, we decided to take a hike in the forest. We followed a trail that led deep into the jungle, surrounded by tall trees and thick foliage. As we walked, the feeling of being watched came back, and then we saw it. A creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was tall, with long arms and legs, covered in a thick black fur. Its eyes glowed and its teeth were sharp and jagged. It let out a howl that echoed through the jungle, and we froze in terror. We immediately turned and ran, our hearts pounding, but the creature was fast, too fast. It chased us through the forest, its howls getting louder and more menacing, but we ran until we couldn't run any more, collapsing on the ground, gasping for breath. By now the creature was nowhere to be seen, but we could still feel its presence, lurking somewhere. Well, as you can imagine, we had a discussion where we decided to leave the island the next day. But before we were able to get the chance, that night, again, something strange happened. I woke up in the middle of the night with a feeling of dread in my stomach. I looked over at my friend's bed, but she wasn't there. I called out for her, but there was no answer, so I got up and walked around the place. But she was still nowhere to be found. But then I saw her. She was standing outside, just in front of the forest, surrounded by a group of creatures. They were all the same, tall, with glowing eyes and sharp teeth, and they were closing in on her. I screamed her name, but she didn't respond. It was like she was in a trance, under the control of the creatures. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed with fear, just watching helplessly as the creatures dragged her deeper into the jungle. Well, I snapped out of my paralysis, and I knew I had to act fast, so without a second thought, I grabbed a flashlight and a large stick and ran out of the place, following the sound of the creature's howls. As I ran through the jungle, the darkness seemed to close in around me, and the sounds of the creatures grew louder. But I pressed on, driven by fear and desperation. Finally, I reached a clearing, where I saw my friend lying on the ground. The creatures were chanting in a language I didn't understand, but it almost sounded human. My friend was just lying there, writhing in agony. So I charged at the creatures, swinging my stick wildly, and they scattered in all directions. I scooped up my friend and started running, not looking back until we were safely back to where we were staying. I'm not sure how I was able to carry her. My arms were hurting, but I guess the adrenaline had pushed me through. My friend was in shock, trembling and gasping for breath. She told me that the creatures had captured her in her sleep, and that they had been performing some kind of ritual on her. She didn't know what they wanted or why they had targeted her, so we decided to leave the island immediately, packing our bags and getting ready to board the small plane that would take us back to civilization. But as we were walking to the plane, again we heard a low growl coming from the forest. We turned around and saw the same creatures we had encountered earlier, standing in a row, blocking our path. My heart sank as I realized that we may be trapped. The creatures started to move closer, their eyes glowing in the darkness. I knew that we were in grave danger, with no escape. But then, something unexpected happened. A group of island locals appeared out of nowhere, armed with machetes and other weapons. They charged at the creatures, driving them back into the jungle. One of the locals approached us and spoke in broken English, telling us we were not safe, and that the island was cursed, and we needed to leave, now. Well, we didn't need to be told twice. We ran to the plane, taking one last look at the island before taking off into the sky. As we flew away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief mixed with terror. We had survived an encounter with something otherworldly, something that defied explanation. And I know I will never forget our terrifying vacation to that cursed island. As a DoorDash driver, I had seen my fair share of strange delivery locations, but the abandoned house on the edge of town definitely took the first prize. When I arrived, the windows were boarded up and the overgrown weeds made it seem like nobody had lived there in years. And yet, this was the correct location. Now, my first thought was that this was some sort of prank delivery, but who in their right mind would prepay for $300 worth of food as a simple joke? Well, either way, I went against my better judgment and got out of my car and approached the house. When I knocked on the door, I noticed a deep, rumbling sound, which immediately raised my suspicions further. I waited at the door for a few more seconds as the tension started to build. I knew I needed to knock on the door again, but I really didn't want to. Well, I eventually found the courage and knocked 3 more times, slowly and deliberate. And this time, I started to hear shuffling footsteps from behind the door, and I felt my heart sink. And then, suddenly, the door swung open to reveal something which still haunts my dreams. My eyes were immediately drawn towards a group of people dressed in black robes, sitting in a circle, holding hands while they hummed in unison. They were gathered around a table that was covered in candles and didn't seem to be fazed at all by my arrival. I hesitated at first, but before I could turn around, one of the cult members who had answered the door grabbed my arm and pulled me inside. "You're just in time," the man said, his grip tightening. We've all been waiting for you." I tried to pull away, but the man wouldn't let go. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to sound calm. The man just smiled, revealing a few missing teeth. "Well, we're hungry, my friend, and you have brought us a feast." I glanced at the table and saw several empty plates, followed by 2 empty chairs. "I'm sorry, but I can't stay," I said, slowly backing away. "I have other deliveries to make." But by this point, several other cult members had gathered by the door and were now blocking my exit. Their eyes filled with a strange intensity. I knew I was in deep trouble, as the strong grip on my arm was loosened, and I was free to move, but with nowhere to go. I could feel a panic start to set in my mind, and I began to wonder if this could be the end of my life. But then, out of seemingly nowhere, a wad of cash was flashed in front of my face. "Please, I insist, stay and eat with us. We promise it will be worth your while." Now, I could instantly tell that this was much more than $300. The wad was as big as my hand, and unless they were paying me in $1 bills, I could tell there was a very big tip in it for me, if I agreed to stay. I hesitated, tempted by the money and fearful of what might happen if I asked to leave again. But something about the way they were all staring at me made me so uneasy. I knew I had to get out of there before it was too late. "I'm sorry, but I have to go," I said, pushing past the cult members and running out of the door. Surprisingly, they didn't try and stop me, but I could feel all of their eyes burning on the back of my head as I ran toward my car. I quickly sped off down the road, heading for the restaurant, and when I arrived, I explained what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They actually demanded that I return and get the cash, as it was a costly order and they needed the money. Well, I refused, claiming that I wasn't willing to risk my life over a stupid DoorDash delivery, and I quit that very same day. Anyway, weeks had eventually gone by, and part of me was curious to see if the restaurant had gotten somebody else to pick up the money. I knew it was possible that the cult weren't necessarily going to kill me or anything. I mean, if they wanted to do that, they had a very good opportunity that night. But still, I felt like if I'd accepted that money, I may have been convinced to do something that I'd regret. Well, my suspicions were correct, as a rumour started to spread that there was a cult in town, and that they were pestering people to join. Apparently their calling card was to invite people over to the house and try to convert them using money and other persuasive techniques. Now, I wouldn't say I'm somebody who is easily manipulated, but the money was tempting even for me, so I could see how someone who was really struggling for money may have been swayed to stay, because my guess is that there was almost $500 in that wad of cash. But either way, I'm just so relieved that I made the right choice that night, and I know I will never deliver food again, because you never really know who's going to be behind that door. I always wanted to take a solo trip, to have a break from my hectic life, the stress of my job and the constant demands of family and friends. So when I saw an ad for a retreat in the mountains, I knew it was just what I needed. The retreat centre was beautiful, nestled in the heart of the Rockies, surrounded by majestic trees and crystal clear streams. It was quiet, serene, and everything I could have ever asked for. I spent the first days in solitude, hiking the trails, meditating by the stream, and practicing yoga on the deck. I felt calm and at peace, but that all changed on the 4th night. I was suddenly awakened by a loud banging on my door. I stumbled out of bed and peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. I dismissed it as a prank, but the banging continued, louder this time. I opened the door, and the hallway was empty. I could hear footsteps in the distance, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. That night, I had a nightmare. I was being chased by someone or something, and no matter how fast I ran, it was always right behind me. I woke up, drenched in sweat, with a sense of impending doom weighing on me. The next day I tried to shake off the feeling, but it was still there. I heard whispers in the wind and saw shadows lurking in the trees. I knew something was out there, waiting for me. On the 5th night, I heard footsteps outside my cabin once again, but this time they were slow and deliberate, as if whoever was out there was trying to stay quiet. I called out, but there was no answer. I could feel my heart pounding as I waited for something to happen, and then there was a knock on my door. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it was definitely a knock. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. I had a feeling that opening the door would be a mistake, but I couldn't shake the fear that something terrible would happen if I didn't. I slowly approached the door, and when I opened it, there was no one there, again. I stepped outside looking around, but there was no one in sight. But out of nowhere, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, and there was a woman standing behind me. She was tall, with long black hair and piercing blue eyes. She was wearing a white dress which seemed to glow in the darkness. I tried to speak, but my voice got caught in my throat. The woman smiled, and her eyes seemed to penetrate my soul. "Don't be afraid. I've been waiting for you." I tried to pull away, but her grip on my shoulder was firm. She leaned in closer, and I could feel her breath on my neck. "You belong to me now," she said, with her voice low and almost hypnotic. I pulled away, running back to my cabin, but I could hear her laughter echoing in my ears. I locked the door behind me and sat in the corner of my room. I didn't know what to do, or who to turn to. I was all alone, and something was very wrong. But then I remembered that I had my phone with me, so I quickly dialed 911 and explained what had happened. At first the operator was confused and didn't really know what to do, but eventually I think I persuaded him with my cries, and they told me that they would send someone to check on me. So I just stayed put until they finally arrived. I waited anxiously, feeling like every minute was an eternity. But finally, I heard a knock on my door again. This time, I knew it wasn't the woman, so I opened the door, and there were 2 police officers standing there. They took my statement and searched the area, but they didn't find anything suspicious. They told me that they would keep an eye on the area and advised me to stay inside for the rest of the night. The next morning, though, I packed my bags and checked out of the retreat center. I just couldn't get over the dread that had settled over me, and I knew I just couldn't stay there any longer. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and I could swear I saw that same woman standing at the edge of the woods. I tried to focus, but she was far away. But I still have dreams where I see her watching me with a strange expression on her face. Anyway, it took me a while to shake off the fear and paranoia that had gripped me during those few days in the mountains. But eventually I was able to put it behind me and move on with my life. Looking back, I'm not sure what that woman wanted from me, or why she chose to target me in particular. but I'm grateful that I was able to escape unharmed, and also I learnt to never underestimate the power of intuition and the importance of taking precautions, especially when travelling alone. I've been an Amazon delivery driver for about 5 years now, so it's safe to say I've seen all sorts of things on the job in my time. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on a quiet street one evening. It was about 7 o'clock in the evening and I was working a late shift to try and earn some extra money. At the time, I was saving up as much as possible so I could put a down payment on a house for me and my now ex-girlfriend. There's definitely a few horror stories I could tell you from that relationship, but I think I'll save those for another day. Anyway, so I pulled up to the house, package in hand, and knocked on the door as normal. There was nothing too suspicious about the house. The front lawn was a bit messy and the fence could have used a lick of paint, but other than that, it just looked like any suburban home. I waited patiently for somebody to answer, but I couldn't hear any movement inside the house. I knocked again, but this time much louder, hoping that if somebody was home, they'd be able to hear me this time. Well, after my second attempt, I noticed the door had slowly creaked open, and something about the way the door moved sent a strange feeling throughout my body. Looking back, it's difficult to explain why it was so unnerving. I guess it was just an instinctual reaction to something only my subconscious could pick up. I hesitated, wondering if I should just leave the package on the doorstep and go, but I needed a signature to complete the delivery, and at the time my paycheck was dependent on how many successful deliveries I made. So, with my future in mind, I went against my better judgment and slowly stepped inside, peering my head around the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing throughout the empty hallway. It was almost pitch black in there, the only light coming from the streetlights outside, illuminating the way. I didn't get a reply, and so I creeped further in, hoping to see if I could get a better sense if anybody was home. But wherever I looked, it was dark, and it became clear to me that there was nobody in that house. So I took one last glance and gave up, assuming that I was just wasting my time. But as I stepped 1 foot outside the house, I suddenly heard a faint whisper from one of the back rooms. I could just about make out it was a woman's voice saying something along the lines of, "I'm back here." I was so relieved that someone was home, and I made my way towards the sound. But as I got closer, that same unnerving feeling resurfaced, and it felt like my body was screaming at me to retreat. There was a strange smell in the air, as if somebody had been cooking some rotten meat, and I swear I almost gagged as I moved further into the house. I called out again, asking if everything was okay, but I received no response. I remember thinking at the time, it's probably just a little old lady who's been struggling with cleaning the house or something, as her voice was quite weak and raspy. To be honest, her voice actually reminded me of my own grandma, and part of me felt obliged to soldier on despite all of the warning signs telling me to turn back. So, I kept moving towards the sound, and that's when I noticed a dim light burning in the kitchen. I crept inside and called out to her once again, asking where she was and if everything was okay. And then I saw her. It was a tiny old lady, and she was sitting in the corner, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't quite make out her face, but I could sense that something was wrong. No matter what I asked her, she continued to ignore me, as if she was in a trance or something. I could see her eyes were open, but whenever I would say anything, she would just continue staring at the floor. In the end, I asked her if I should call an ambulance, and she suddenly perked up and rose to her feet almost immediately. She stared right into my eyes and told me not to worry and apologized for the inconvenience. She claimed that she was on some new medication that was making her a bit drowsy and she would struggle to stay awake at times, but this didn't do too much to ease my fear. She had this warm smile combined with a pair of wide eyes that felt like they didn't belong to her face. But despite my fear, I held it together and simply told her not to worry and that I just needed her signature quickly and I would be gone. She replied, "Of course, young man," and approached me slowly, but without breaking eye contact. It was honestly so unnerving. I felt like I was in a horror movie and I was the idiot that didn't just run away after sensing danger. But I remained strong and handed her the device for her to sign. To my surprise, she didn't struggle like I thought she would. In my experience, the older customers usually had some trouble with signing their name on a small device, but her signature was flawless. Anyway, I handed her the package and she asked me to set it down on the floor, as she didn't want to hurt her back. I did as she asked and set down the package, but as it connected with the floor, I could sense that it was hollow, as if there was something below. Now, this isn't particularly scary, but after I'd worked myself up, this really was the last straw for me. I was not going to be the next victim of some crazy old lady that likes to keep delivery drivers in her basement. So with that, I wished her well and headed out the dark kitchen, towards the front door. But as I turned around, I heard her whisper something under her breath. I turned back and asked her to repeat herself as I'd missed what she said, but she just smiled once again and told me not to worry. Her voice was louder all of a sudden, more pronounced, like she was back from her trance and fully conscious again. I just awkwardly smiled back and power-walked to the front door, and pretty much ran to my van. Now, this experience would have been scary enough, but as I began to pull away from the house, I noticed some movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked out the van window and saw that same little old lady standing in her doorway, but this time there was no smile. I slammed my foot down on the gas and sped off, not looking back. Over the years, I've told this story to my friends so many times, and they always end up laughing at me. I guess it is kind of funny that a small old lady was able to scare me this much, but as I always tell them, if you were in my position, trust me, you would have been just as terrified. I am one of those people who are just absolutely obsessed by everything Japan related, so when I finally had the opportunity to take a vacation there, I was beyond excited. I was only travelling on my own, but to me it was absolutely fine. I heard that Tokyo was quite safe anyway, so I didn't expect any issues. I arrived in Tokyo late at night, eager to explore the city the next day. I was so happy because my first few days in Tokyo were absolutely amazing. I visited beautiful temples and shrines, shopped in colourful markets, and tasted delicious local cuisine. Honestly, it was everything I could have imagined and more. But I think it was maybe the third or fourth day of my trip, where things took a turn, for the worse. I had decided to take a day trip to an old village located in the mountains. The village was known for its traditional architecture and beautiful scenery, and when I arrived, I was immediately struck by the beauty of the place. It was like stepping back in time. But as I explored the village, I started to feel a bit uneasy. Every time I turned around, I caught glimpses of people staring at me from behind doors and windows. I tried to shake off the feeling and continued my exploration, But that uneasy feeling was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Anyway, as the day went on, the village became increasingly deserted. I was seeing fewer and fewer people, until eventually I was completely alone. And that's when I started to hear the whispers. At first they were just faint murmurs that I could barely make out. But as I walked further into the village, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. I couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but they sounded angry and malevolent. At this point I started to feel like I was in danger, like something was closing in around me. I ran through the empty streets looking for any way out, but every path seemed to lead me back to where I had started. And then I saw them. A group of people dressed in traditional clothing, with these creepy masks on their face making them almost unidentifiable. They were just standing there in the middle of the street, blocking my way out. So I turned around and tried to run away, but they were so fast. They very quickly closed in on me, their masks looming closer and closer to my face. I felt like I was suffocating, and that's the last thing I remember. When I woke up, I was lying face down on the ground in the middle of the village. It was pitch black and I could barely see anything. I felt so disoriented and confused. As I tried to stand up, I realized that something was wrong. My body felt different, like it was no longer mine. And then I heard a voice in my head. It was deep and menacing, and it told me that I was no longer human. I was horrified. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were twisted and gnarled, covered in scales and claws. I found a nearby pond, and when I looked in and saw my reflection, I noticed that my eyes had turned yellow, and my teeth had grown into sharp fangs. I don't know how it happened or what had been done to me. All I knew was that I was no longer human, and I may be trapped in that village forever. All I could think to do in that moment was run and just keep running. Eventually I stumbled upon a small pub, and I walked inside in the hopes of speaking to someone to try and help me. There was a small old lady who worked behind the bar. There was nobody else in there, and she immediately greeted me as if I was family. She asked me if I was tired, and I explained that yes, I was, but I had also been through quite the traumatic event. She just gestured at me to come closer and told me not to worry and to follow her. Well, I didn't know what else to do, so I followed her to the back of the pub, where there was a small room with a nice comfy bed. She told me to just lie down and all of my worries would simply disappear. I was, of course, skeptical, but I was in no position to be turning down any help. Anyway, I eventually fell asleep in that bed. But when I woke up, I was in the middle of the street again, this time not feeling that same strange feeling. I could remember where the pond was, and I ran directly over to it to check my reflection. And to my surprise, everything was normal. To this day, I still have no idea what the hell happened. I remember rushing back to the closest train station and getting on the quickest flight home. But you may be surprised to hear that despite this traumatic experience, I still very much love Japan, but I don't think I will be returning any time soon. I had always been interested in the unknown, the unexplained. So when I saw something strange in the sky that night, I knew I had to investigate it. Once I saw it, I knew it was a UFO, no doubt about it, a glowing, disc-shaped object hovering in the air, its lights pulsing and shifting in eerie patterns. I watched it for what felt like hours, mesmerized by the sight. And then, suddenly, it began to move. It darted across the sky, faster than anything I had ever seen before. And then, just as suddenly, it vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. At first, I was exhilarated. I had witnessed something quite amazing, something that very few people had ever seen before. But as the days went on, my exhilaration soon turned to fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched or followed. Everywhere I went, I felt as if there were eyes on me, unseen and unblinking. And then, it all came to a head one night, when I suddenly woke up in my bed, unable to move. It was as if I was paralyzed, frozen in place. I could feel a cold breeze on my skin, and I heard a strange humming sound, like a distant generator. And that's when I saw them. They were tall and slender, with pale, elongated heads and large black eyes. They moved with a fluid grace, their movements eerily silent. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, and couldn't even scream. They approached me, and I could feel their cold, clammy hands on my skin, probing and examining me. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. They left me alone, trembling and sweating in my room. I didn't know what to do, or who to turn to. I felt as if I was losing my mind, slipping further and further into a nightmare world where nothing made sense. Well, after around a week, I saw that UFO again. But this time, it was hovering over my house, with its lights pulsing and shifting in a pattern that almost seemed to mock me. I knew then that I was being targeted and monitored, and that I was in grave danger. But I still didn't know what to do, or how to defend myself. Days turned into weeks, and my fear and paranoia only grew. I tried to tell my friends and family about what had happened, but they just looked at me with pity and concern. Of course, they didn't believe me, and just thought I was imagining things, or it was probably a dream. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, and I also knew that I couldn't just sit back and wait for them to return. I began to research. I scoured the internet for any information I could find on UFOs. I read books, watched documentaries, talked to people who claimed to have had similar experiences. And then, one day, I found it. A group of people who called themselves the Resistance. They were a network of individuals who had all experienced UFO sightings and other abductions, and they had banded together to fight back. Well, I reached out to them immediately, desperate for help and guidance, and to my surprise, they responded. They invited me to a meeting where I met other people who had been through what I had. We shared our stories, our hopes and our fears, and then they showed me something that changed everything. It was a device, some sort of weapon that they claimed could protect us from the aliens if they ever did return. It was a small handheld device that emitted a high-frequency sound that was supposedly unbearable to the aliens. I was skeptical at first, but again, I was desperate. I snatched the device out of their hand and promised to use it if I ever did see that UFO again. Well, days soon turned into weeks, and then into months, and I started to feel like I would never see that UFO ever again. But then, one night, it finally returned. I was walking home from work when I saw the UFO hovering over my house once again. But this time, I was ready. I grabbed the device and I aimed it directly at the UFO and pressed the button. I saw the UFO begin to shake, tremble, and eventually explode into a burst of light and sound. And then it was all over. The sky was silent, still, and I knew that I had won. But even as I celebrated my victory, I knew that I could never go back to the life I once had before. I had seen too much, experienced too much, and I knew that they were still out there, watching and waiting, and no doubt plotting their revenge. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. I had planned it for months, saving up every penny I could to make it happen. An entire week in a remote cabin in the Canadian wilderness, surrounded by nothing but nature and wildlife. What more could you want? It was supposed to be peaceful and rejuvenating, a chance to get away from the stress of everyday life. But from the moment I arrived, things started to feel off. Firstly, the cabin was old and creaky, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. The windows were covered in dust and cobwebs, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That first night I tried to settle in, but every sound made me jump, and I could hear strange noises coming from outside. There was scratching and rustling, like something was moving in the woods. The next morning I woke up to find that something had been in the cabin with me. The furniture was overturned, and there were scratches on the walls. I could see muddy footprints leading from the door to the window, like something had come in and then left again. I tried to convince myself that it was just a bear, or maybe a raccoon, but I knew, deep down, it was something else, something malevolent. As the days went on, things only got worse. Every night I would hear those same strange noises outside, like something was almost circling the cabin. And every morning I would find more evidence that something had been inside. I thought about leaving, but as I hadn't yet been in any real danger, I thought it was just stupid. So I remained. But then, on that third night, was when I woke up to find that my cabin door was open. I could feel the cold wind blowing in, and I could hear something moving outside. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I was paralyzed with fear. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and thin, with long arms and legs. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and I could see sharp teeth glinting in its open mouth. The figure stepped closer, its long fingers reaching out towards me. And then everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining outside and the cabin was quiet. But I knew that something had happened to me. Something had taken hold of my mind and my body, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for me. Well, I packed my bags and left the cabin that same day, never looking back. But even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that figure in the woods. I can still hear its breathing and feel its touch, and I know that I will never truly be free. My family and I had planned a trip to one of the biggest and most popular theme parks in the country. We were in California, and I think that's as much as I can say. My little brother was thrilled, but I wasn't as excited as I thought I would be. Something just felt off from the moment that we arrived. We got there early in the morning and started exploring the various attractions. As we walked through the park, I started to notice a man who seemed to be following us. He was tall and thin, with dark, piercing eyes that seemed to be staring right through me. He wore all black, and his clothes were old and ragged. At first, I tried to ignore him, thinking that he was just another visitor. But no matter where we went, he was always there. I mean, he was in line with us for the roller coaster, he stood in front of us as we waited for the Ferris wheel, and he even followed us into the food court. The coincidences were adding up, and soon it became quite apparent that this man was, in fact, following us. As the day went on, I just started to feel more and more uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was dangerous somehow, with his eyes seeming to follow us everywhere we went, and I could feel his stare burning into my soul. My parents noticed that I seemed tense and tried to reassure me that everything was fine, but that didn't do much good. As the sun started to set, we decided to go on one last ride before we left the park, a slow boat ride that wound through a dark underground tunnel. To be honest, I thought that being in an enclosed space where nobody could get me would make me feel a lot safer, but I was so wrong. As the boat made its way through the tunnel, I heard a voice behind me. It was the man, and he was speaking in a low, menacing whisper. I turned around, and that's when I saw him sitting behind us, his eyes fixed on me. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was closing up. I couldn't move, and there was no way to escape. That ride felt like it lasted forever, but finally, it was over. As we stepped off the boat, I turned to look for the man, but he was nowhere to be seen. I wanted to tell my parents what had happened, but I was too afraid to speak. That night I barely slept, just imagining the man's dark, piercing eyes staring at me, and I knew he was still out there, somewhere, just waiting for me. Well, it's safe to say, I will never go back to that theme park ever again. Thank you for watching, and for more scary stories, check out the video on screen now.